You guys can just sit there. I'll like intro from here, but otherwise.
That is where? Boys and girls, ladies,
You can arrange it then. Yeah, great.
Well, our point of view is obvious. It's not like it's completely secret. Dan, do you want us to take a chair?
Take the what?
One chair away?
Oh, sure.
You can say it. I want to sit next to the Australians. I'm lost. You know these Australian national flag, the Australian Indigenous flag of Aboriginal people, and the Australian flag of Indigenous people from Torres Strait. They're always on the three flags are always on the embassies around the world.
I didn't know that. So why are they? I was wondering why were the flags.
It.
Okay.
Stand.
No, I think so.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but I'm sure we can figure it out. Great. Okay. Let's do it. All right, we're going to get started, so folks can take their seat, get their coffees. I wanted to start by acknowledging that we are here in the Australian Pavilion. And what that really means is that we are here in the pavilion of the traditional owners of Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. I want to recognize elders past, present, and emerging. And also just state that the elephant in the room, we recently had a referendum in Australia on recognizing Aboriginal people in our Constitution, and that referendum failed. The union movement put our shoulder to the wheel to get it across the finish line, but we fell short. So I think it's important to acknowledge that despite the ill-informed, and if I can be so bold, cowardly opinions of too many Australians, we are going to keep fighting for the rights and recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and that it always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Great, thank you. So we're here today to talk about just transition. Just transition at its heart is a very simple concept. As we transition to net zero and fully decarbonized economy over the next 27 years at this point, that the enormous opportunities and the real challenges of that transition get distributed equally across society. So, more than 10 years ago, the Australian union movement, and particularly our brothers and sisters at the Mining and Energy Union of Australia, saw the writing on the wall. It was clear that the coal-fired power sector in Australia, that its days were numbered, and that we would have to transition away from that industry. And that quite possibly, the scope of that transition was going to expand over time to include other industries. The other recognition that was clear to us 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, was that if we left the dynamics of that transition solely to the whims of the free market, that would result in entire communities, even entire regions, entering an economic death spiral, where workers were not taken care of, towns were not taken care of, shops on the main street would be boarded up, and people who had once had proud union jobs at good wages would be forced onto the unemployment line. And that to avoid that happening, and to make sure that the communities that have powered Australia for decades continue to power Australia, just with new sources of energy, the government would have to have a firm hand on that steering wheel. So, back in 2014, I think it was, the union movement put out its first position paper on the need for a national energy transition authority that could guarantee a just transition in the energy sector. And then we proceeded to be ignored for about a decade. Because under a decade of conservative government in Australia, under the coalition, advocating around just transition was like banging our heads against a brick wall. And you know, to their credit, when you've got your head in the sand, it is often quite hard to see very far. So they didn't see as far as we did, but we knew it was coming and we knew what policy was necessary. Thankfully, last year we had a change of government, and this government has really stepped up to the plate to take this issue with the serious gravity that it deserves. And after what I would describe as boisterous campaigning from the union movement, decided to step up and establish that National Energy Transition Authority, calling it, titling it somewhat ambiguously the National Net Zero Authority, but this is what it is. It's an authority tasked with three things. First, to support workers in carbon-intensive industries that are phasing down, in particular coal-fired power. Two, to help the regions that are dependent on those industries diversify economically and plan economically for their future. And three, to play an investor facilitation role to make sure that capital invested in the clean economy was getting where it needed, when it needed to be in Australia. And so the panel today, and this was a big step for Australia, and we have joined a small but growing pantheon of countries that have established national net just transition bodies. So the Germans have been doing this for a while. The Spanish government, which we'll hear about today, has an incredibly interesting approach to this. The Scottish government, I know the Nigerian government and the Canadian government are also investigating just transition policies. And so Australia is the new breakout star on this scene, and I wanted to share a little bit about, and have our panelists share a little bit about, A, what is this authority actually? How did it get established and what will it do? And what are the issues we're still paying attention to in its policy design? Because the legislation won't get passed till next year, and we all know the devil's in the details. Two, how does that system compare to systems we see in other countries? And we have distinguished comrades here from Spain and Nigeria who will give us a little wisdom on that. And then finally, what does all of this mean? What does this growing domestic policy conversation mean for the Just Transition Work Program we're litigating here at COP, which will be a really important outcome. And I think there are some lessons to take from the Australian example, from the Spanish example, from the Nigerian example, to inform what will hopefully be a positive final text that we get in a matter of, 48, 72 hours. So, wanted to introduce our panelists, starting next to the beautiful golden kangaroo over there, which I hope you're all appreciating. I understand it was a hassle to ship. So we have Alison Tate. She's the Director of Economic and Social Policy at the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the global peak body for labor unions, represents over 200 million workers worldwide and their families. And so if the ITUC was a country, I looked this up yesterday, it would be like the 6th most populous country in the world, on par with Brazil, basically. So Alison's a very big deal. And she's also been the 2014 Moynihan NGO Fellow at Syracuse University in my home country of the United States. Next, we have Comrade Echezono Asuzu, or Etch, as we call him. He's the Principal Assistant General Secretary at the Nigerian Labor Congress, and also the Nigerian Labor Congress's National Coordinator on Climate Change, Green Jobs, and Just Transition. He is also on Nigeria's National Steering Committee of the same name, where he sits alongside key government ministries and the National Employers Org. So he's got his hands in a lot of pots. We have Alison Goodwin. We have double Alison on this panel, very exciting. She is the National Research and Policy Officer at the Mining and Energy Union for Australia, represents Australia's coal mining, coal power, and other mining and energy workers, and advises them on energy policy, climate issues, and on global industry trends. And last, but certainly not least, we have Manuel Riera, who is the National Director at the Unión General de Trabajadores in Spain. I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation. National Director of Climate Action and Just Ecological Transition. He is also on various national committees in Spain, the Environmental Advisory Council, the National Water Council, the National Climate Council, the National Council on National Parks, and the State Council on Natural Heritage and Biodiversity. I don't know how you find the time, but that's a lot of committees. And at the EU level, he sits on the Just Transition Committee for the European Trade Union Confederation. So we have a lot of experts up here, and I'm now happy to turn the mic over to them. And I'll start with Alison Goodwin. If you can tell us a little bit more about this Net Zero Authority in Australia. How did it come to pass? What is it? And what policy design elements are we paying attention to as it gets instantiated in legislation?
Thanks, Dan. So we've got this fantastic international panel, so I hope I can maybe provide a bit of a local perspective on what this authority will mean to our members. On current trajectory, it's very likely that all of our coal power stations will close by 2040, possibly even 2035, and also the domestic coal mines that exclusively supply domestic power stations, those workers will be affected too. Like a lot of energy regions across the world, power is generated in the regions, not in the cities, so usually the community is highly reliant on that source of economic activity. In Australia, we're kind of unique because those regions are especially remote, sometimes 100 kilometres from the nearest industrial centre, and they're also have especially low economic diversity. And I want to point to a statistic because we're already seeing power stations close. We've got to catch up a little bit with this authority, and the impact of those closures really, and the kind of the way that it impacts economic activity in the community is quite clear with this statistic. The E61 Institute was this researcher. So Australian coal power station workers made redundant after a closure earned 69% less in the first year after redundancy, compared to 43% less for all workers in the Australian economy. And even 4 years later, they were still earning 50% less, compared to 29% less for all other redundant workers. So, I mean, yes, it's true that energy workers are on high incomes, but also it's looking at that impact on the removal of that source of economic activity from a community. So there's a particular example in the Latrobe Valley that really pushed home the reason that we needed a national government response. So in November of 2016, the French energy company Engie announced they would close Hazelwood Power Station with 5 months' notice. So by the next March, it was closed. It affected 750 workers across the power station and the attached mine. At the time, the federal government was not interested in a policy response at all. So as a union, we looked to what we could do and the support also we could get from the Victorian government at a state level. We set up the Hazelwood Worker Transfer Scheme that was agreed between us, the Victorian government, and the operators of the other power stations in the Latrobe Valley region, Yallourn and Loy Yang A and B. And the scheme that we came up with was an incentive for workers at those other power stations to take a generous early retirement package if they wanted to, and then to open up those vacancies for redundant Hazelwood workers to be redeployed to those other power stations in the region. So it's a really great idea. It's kind of reflective of things that occurred in the Ruhr Valley in Germany over many decades as the black coal industry there phased down. But the issue we ran into was that there were no obligations placed on the other power companies to employ the redeployed workers or to make any real efforts towards the targets that were being set. So in the end, on our figures, we had about 230 expressions of interest in the early retirement package, and only 90 were accepted, and only 88 Hazelwood workers were redeployed through that program. So really, there's like about 150 workers that could have been redeployed, but there was no obligation on those employers to fulfil the commitments they'd made in the negotiation of that scheme. So, we realised then, and of course it became very obvious that we needed the regulatory power of the federal government and also the symbolic power of the national government taking action to make sure that in future we had a better outcome for those workers and communities affected by coal power closures. So getting to the Net Zero Authority, we're very, very pleased that the government has committed to establish this authority. Currently, the public servants working on the authority are in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and that's a really, really good sign that it's a priority. And it's also great we have the president of our union and the president of the ACTU on the advisory panel for that process. And I guess we're following closely. There are two things that are really, really important for us to see when this authority gets set up. The first is we need it to have regulatory power. We need the schemes that it creates for workers to be enforceable so that we don't kind of have a repeat of what happened with Hazelwood. And we need, I don't think it's enough to, for example, have a training program to support workers here and some job creation programs over there without an infrastructure to get the worker from A to B. There needs to be an actual connection between the two. Otherwise, I don't think it's really going to fulfill what's needed. It might be nice, but it's not going to make that difference to our members. And the other thing, and it sounds kind of obvious, but we do need actual job creation in these communities, ongoing jobs, secure jobs, well-paid jobs. On an individual level, a worker who's in their 50s may benefit from an early retirement package, but a community that loses hundreds of its best-paying jobs won't recover from an early retirement package. So we need the job creation in those locations because our members, they don't want to move. They want their children to have opportunities in their communities. Coal communities are they have a strong community focus and this kind of long legacy of really powering the nation, and there's that attachment to community that our members want to retain. So that's, I guess, our story for what we want for the authority and why we want it. I think it will be interesting internationally because in Australia we don't have social dialogue with employers. The relationship is very adversarial. Typically, workers don't have a voice in the pathway of their company. And so some of the examples we see in Europe where social dialogue is in place, how do we apply that to Australia? And if we can, what lessons are there for other countries, which I think will be really important. So thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks so much, Alison 1. Alison 2, we'll get you in a second. So that's what's going on in Australia. I think there are details still to be filled in a piece of legislation that will be passed next year. But what we're talking about here is an actual binding framework. Like, the intention here is not just grand words about just transition, but to work out the mechanics of how you actually support the workers who are exposed to the transition, and then how you actually drive investment into those communities so they have new opportunities. And we are, and I don't think I ever introduced myself. I'm Dan. work for the peak body. I'm the climate lead for the peak body for labor unions in Australia. And we are going to be remaining deeply involved in this process until the legislation's set, so that we make sure that there are actual baselines beneath these policies, and none of it kind of diffuses into hot air. But we know that we have a very good dancing partner with the government as opposed to last government, so it's a good sign. But I wanted to turn to Manuel to tell us a little bit. So the Spanish, I remember being up late many nights searching through Spanish language websites for documents that would tell me more about the Spanish just transition strategy. And luckily, they were a bit buried, but those documents existed and they were extremely helpful. And you guys are really doing some pioneering work in Spain on just transition policy. So tell us more about the history there and what you got.
Thank you, Dan. I think we also have documents in English, so. Well, thank you very much, Dan, for inviting me to participate in this interesting panel. I think that, having a space to share our vision on the just transition in Spain is very relevant. As I think you all know, Spain is one of the countries that had made more progresses in just transition. When I attend meetings, both European and global level, we always hold Spain up as an example. But for us, it is far from perfect also. So I think it's important to share our perspective. So I'm going to tell the process we have done and I think the main lesson learned in this process. So in February 2019, the Just Transition Strategy was approved together with the Climate Change and Energy Transition Law and also with the National Integrated Energy and Climate Plan. And in addition, 3 years later, the Climate Change and Energy Transition Law incorporate the obligation to approve just transition strategies every 5 years to deal with the ongoing effects of decarbonization. I think it's the only law in the world that includes this obligation, and I think it's really positive, but we demand more participation because it's supposed that we will have a new strategy next year in 2024, and we have no idea about how it's going the process. So the actual just transition strategy include for a short-term challenges related to the closure of coal minings and coal power plants, an urgent action plan to address the impacts in the region affected. The starting point for this urgent action plan was 2 sectorial agreements. On the one hand, the framework agreement for a just transition for coal mining and the sustainable development of mining regions for the period 2019-2027, signed by the government, trade unions, and the main coal mining employer organization in October 2018. And secondly, the agreement for a just transition for coal power plants that was signed between the companies that own the plants, trade unions, and the government in April 2020, with commitments for the relocation of workers, training activities, and the search for alternative industrial projects. And in addition, set up in the Just Transition Strategy, the Just Transition Institute was founded in April 2020. I think that it is essential that within the government there is a structure focused only on just transition. Although we know that just transition has to be included in all policies, there should be no doubt who is leading the process within the government. So in the Spanish case, trade union, the problem is that we have a very little participation. We are only 4 members on the Advice Council, so we demand more participation in this institute and also the creation of a Just Transition Observatory at national level where we can analyze the results of the measure implemented. So one of the main objectives of this Just Transition Institute is to implement the Just Transition Agreements as tools to develop plans in the areas most affected by the closure of mines and coal power plants. Nowadays, there are 15 Just Transition Agreements in Spain. I think it's important that beyond the 2 sectorial agreements that we have with unions, companies, and the government, the Just Transition Agreements are a key element in order to respond to the particular socioeconomic impacts in the affected areas. So for each just transition agreement, a protocol was signed between all the administrations concerned, like central, regional, and local level. So strengths and weaknesses for the new developments were identified, and also channels were open to receive contributions and projects proposal. And in these 15 just transition agreements, more than 2,000 contributions were received from over 800 social actors. So, of course, there is no doubt that we are a very advanced country, but unions, we are very demanding because the situation calls for it. And we see that, despite of all these measures, it is not always enough. There are workers who end up losing their jobs. And, of course, we know that achieving a just transition where no one and nowhere is left behind is very difficult. So what causes social discontent in some regions is that the solution don't arrive on time. So the main problem is that we are not providing real alternatives to all people affected because the lack of anticipation. And I think the anticipation is a really key idea that I want to convey. It is essential to generate real alternatives for workers before closing happen. So to disconnect an activity, you have to plug in another first. We know that ecological transition generates more jobs than it destroys. What we need to achieve is that the jobs created falls together in time and place with the jobs that are destroyed. In Spain, what is happening is that finally, if a worker spent a long time between his end of activity and his net job, he eventually has no choice but to move elsewhere. So this is a loss of population in the region affected. All the projects included in the Just Transition agreements are fine. It is very positive because we have like a big projects, but also small projects. And it is good that there is an economic diversification into energy and environmental projects, but also into cultural projects or innovation ones. However, the big problem is from design to implementation, a lot of time passes that we often do not have. So we demand that the projects need to be implemented more quickly and reducing bureaucracy. So in addition, I want to emphasize the territorial vision of Just Transition, because Just Transition actions need to be worked out locally across sector. In Spain, there are many regions where a coal power plant practically drives the entire local economy. So when it closes, it is easier to protect the direct jobs than all the indirect and induced ones. So what happened with workers in hotels, in restaurants, in schools, in pharmacies? Just Transition must include these workers too. And another key element I want to convey is that we need to expand the focus of Just Transition to other sectors beyond energy production. We are demanding our government during the last 5 years that we need to expand the focus of Just Transition to many other sectors that will be affected by climate change mitigation policies, such as automobile or mobility sector, and also by the sectors who will be affected by the physical impacts of climate change, like agriculture, tourism, health sector, like energy services, infrastructure, etc. So that's why we demand Just Transition plans, Just Transition strategy for both mitigation but also adaptation to climate change. And we often think that as the Just Transition as a tool to minimize the negative impact of ecological transition on employment. However, Just Transition also needs to be a tool to maximize job creation opportunities. So Spain has a lot of potential in wind and solar energy sectors or renewable hydrogen. Thanks to Just Transition, we have to take advantage to this opportunity and get industries to set up in the territory. So the Just Energy Transition must be an industrial revolution. And I believe that the main lesson learned, in addition to the anticipation that I said was fundamental, is that social dialogue is needed. Just Transition must take place locally, in companies, in the real life of workers, not in offices. So that's why unions has to be at the table and be part of the process and the decision making. Therefore, we realize that it is also necessary that to have more support for trade unions organization, so that we can prepare and participate in the just transition with guarantees in all levels, at national, but also at local, even at company level. And it is fundamental to have a good training and reskilling programs. We must avoid the lack of training becomes the bottleneck of the ecological transition. Some sectors has already told us that they cannot progress as quickly as they could because they can't find workers with the necessary knowledge. So in this point, I think it is essential to analyze the green skills of new jobs and have an educational and training system that can cover these skills, and also to remember that companies must also be responsible for providing training to their workers. And another key element is the quality of the jobs, because new green jobs being created cannot be worse than those that have been destroyed. And we have to be aware that a job, even if it's good for the planet, does not necessarily have to be good for people. And so just in summary, I think that a great job has been done in Spain so far, demonstrating that just transition is possible, but we have to keep going. We can't stop for a second because many people and many lives are at stake. And beyond adequate funding and that companies have to be part of the solution, I think that everything boils down to anticipation and more participation. So let's be quick and not lose this great opportunity to achieve an ambitious green transition that reduces inequality and put workers at the center. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuel. I also like that as you were finishing, we got like an inspiring soundtrack from the other room to crescendo your speech. That was really useful. And obviously, like, even the countries on the cutting edge of this right now are still figuring it out and still adjusting their policy mechanisms to suit the ongoing transition, which is going to be happening for decades. And that will always have to be anticipating and participating in, as you say. So that's really important. I wanted to go to you, Etch, to find out about where the just transition conversation is out in Nigeria, and what sorts of policies the Nigerian government is considering putting in place, or what sort of policies the NLC is advocating for them to put in place.
Okay, thank you, Brother Dan, for the opportunity. It's actually surprising to hear that some of the comments from my fellow panelists, on what has happened to just transition in their countries. I'm really surprised that countries of the Western Hemisphere, are having these kind of challenges. And that tells us that this is a commonly shared phenomenon all over the world. And it's something that we need to embrace as the working class community. In Nigeria, we have had quite a rough time trying to get our faces in the room and get our voices heard concerning this issue of just transition. First is that Nigeria passed into law the Climate Change Act that was in November 18th, 2021 by the immediate past President Muhammadu Buhari. He signed the act into law, but then there was not sufficient, in fact, there was hardly any consultation with workers. And that law was hurriedly passed into law from our own point of view. When we looked at the content of that act, we saw that workers were completely shut out from that act. And that for us was a rallying call. We had to move into action and began to see what can be done to actually get workers into that space. That motivated us to form a network of workers from different unions, trade unions, across the different sectors of the economy, both public and private. And that helped us to begin to talk to ourselves. That helped us to begin to generate the needed, get the needed information and generate the kind of energy we needed to be able to engage. And from there, we began to press hard on the doors of government. First, to openly denounce or to stress our concern that workers' input was not carried along or mainstreamed in the Climate Change Act. That for us was the first policy engagement we had with government. So why did you pass this law? And workers, through their representative trade unions and centers, were not carried along. And then people became alarmed, said, that is true, oh, that is true, oh, that is true. We didn't consult workers. It's like they forgot us all through. And when you read the 35 sections of the Nigeria Climate Change Act, you'll see there is no mention of workers in that document. There's no mention of workers. 35 sections. And then when you look at the composition of the council, because that act set up the National Climate Change Council. Now, that is the focal point institution for climate change and environmental issues in Nigeria. And then in that 23-member council, there's no worker there. Nobody is representing workers. So those were things we pointed out and said, this is totally unacceptable. Because we've been able to, over the years, apart from the issue of climate change and environmental justice, we've been able to make a lot of noise about social dialogue in Nigeria. Remember, during the time of Comrade Ayuba Waba, there were a lot of efforts made to ensure that the space for social dialogue was expanded in Nigeria. And that made government to begin to look at how can we get more of the meetings of the National Council, National Labour Advisory Council. And so that space was there, but it was never used to even discuss the issue of climate change, the issue of just transition. So we began to knock on doors, and then people began to pay a little attention. Then we also talked to development partners. We talked to the ILO and said, this is a concern for us. Why is the Nigerian government not involving workers in this kind of very sensitive policy initiative? And then that was how the National Steering Committee came about. And they said, well, let's form a National Steering Committee and let's get everybody involved. And then all the ministries that were relevant to the issue were all nominated, including the Nigeria Labour Congress. I served on that committee. And then we began to talk. And then the conversation now is that the National Climate Change Act is up for review by next year. So by next year, we should be able to have a lot of voice into what goes on into that document. So for us, the big win is that we're able to get ourselves in the room. We were not invited. We had to badge at the door. We had to knock, and knock hard to get hard. And I think from what I'm hearing, that appears to be the situation also across the room. So for us, our work is cut out. We cannot relent, we cannot relax and say they should include us. We have a duty to go and make a demand. Like we always say in Nigeria, there is nothing workers have gotten that was not out of struggle. We always have to struggle each step of the way. Maybe we can find other solutions that will make us struggle less. Maybe we can find ideas that will make us struggle less. But for now, we just have to struggle for virtually everything. But we're happy. We are now being listened to. For the first time, we came to the Conference of the Parties. We've been participating in the Conference of the Parties since 2009. In fact, I was the first person from the Nigeria Labour Congress to participate in the Conference of the Parties. That was in Copenhagen, you know. And since then, we've been participating. But then, nobody has even taken cognizance of what we represent. That the fact of the matter is that climate change is about workers. And that's the point I always make everywhere. Climate change is centrally about workers. Because the greenhouse gases that cause this problem, they are all emitted virtually. Almost all the greenhouse gases are emitted in the workplace. And workers are the front line in this emission crisis. So it's about workers, and that is something we must all own up to and be able to defend this stuff called just transition. And as a matter of fact, just transition itself is an initiative by workers. I remember somebody like Tony Mazucchi, former president of the Atomic Workers Union in the United States, now also incorporated as the steel workers. He started some of these things, and he began to make the campaign. And then down in Dubai, 2023, we are finding it difficult to even understand what is the meaning of just transition. I think there's been a lot of fallow grounds, a lot of grounds that we need to cover, because this is our contribution to the global discussion on climate change, and we must take that space, we must own that space. In Nigeria, we are trying a little bit belatedly to actually come on board, because as a matter of fact, we slept, and that is also our own blame. When the Climate Change Act was being passed through Parliament, yes, they rushed through it, but we should have actually intervened when that climate change bill was being debated in the Parliament, but we did not. So some of these things are some of the issues that we need to tackle. How do we get our information system right so that when things happen, we're always in the know? We don't react when the deed is done. So those are some of the lessons for us in Nigeria. We didn't respond, we didn't react quick enough. And for us, we've taken that on board, and we want, going forward, to be able to open up the valves of information so that we're able to know when something is going on, we know what is going on, we know who is responsible, we know who to talk to, and then also how to take actions and initiatives. I must say that on the issue of training and reskilling is important, but under it is the issue of research. We need data to fly. We cannot fly blind in this matter. If we must make quality interventions, if we must make quality decisions, if we must make quality input into the just transition discussion, we must have the numbers on our hands. And the Nigeria Labour Congress, we've started on that trajectory. Before now, we had done something on petroleum and agriculture, but Nigeria in the past 2 years, we've expanded the national determined contributions and also our focal priority sectors, which are now 7 instead of 5. So what we have done this year is to do a research on the 7 priority sectors, to see what are the gaps, where are workers lacking the kind of skills that are needed to be able to move into the green economy pathway. So those are some of the things we have done, and we presented it during our side event here. And all we're saying is that we need to get the numbers right. How many workers are affected in Australia? How many workers are going to be affected? How many jobs are on the line? In England, in UK, in Brazil, we need to get these numbers out so that when we go to the policy space, we have numbers on our hands and we can say this is a real threat. Because the climate change issue is about real people, it's about real communities, it's about real economies, it's about real livelihoods. So we must get this information out there, get our research well done so that we can be able to properly intervene. And let me just stop it at this point. Thank you.
Incredibly helpful, thank you. That deserves a round of applause. And best of luck to you in actually getting that Climate Change Act to reflect the reality of the structural adjustment we're trying to pull off here. A structural adjustment that will only happen with and through workers. Like literally, who's building the renewable energy plants, who is decarbonizing the homes, who's electrifying them, who's building the public transit. All of that is workers. And so forget even about altruism. If workers aren't at the table and setting these frameworks for how all of it is carried out, it probably won't work very well. So incredibly important edge. Last but certainly not least, Alison Tate. I would love you to kind of zoom this conversation out to the international level and here in the UNFCCC context. Obviously, last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, there was a decision to pursue a just transition work program, and that was sort of like an empty box that the parties could fill in. And so what are the lessons we've learned here in the domestic policy examples we've been describing? What do they tell us about what's necessary from this Just Transition Work Program? What do we need to see there in that box?
So firstly, Dan, I really want to say I'm very proud to be on a panel with members of the ITUC as the national members of a global body of people who care and are pushing and are advocating for and own just transition for the last 30 years. And I'm also proud to be in my home country's pavilion. But here in the climate negotiations, we have seen for years and years, since we won those 2 important words back in the Paris Agreement, not enough action. A lot of talking, a lot of sharing, a lot of hot air, frankly. Because whilst just transition measures are being enacted on the ground in workplaces, in different industries, at national level to some good examples, some to be improved examples, the reality is that here at a global level, having dialogue with the real economic actors is what's important. And this Just Transition Work Program is about having an engagement to fulfill on how to do it and to show that progress is being done, and where progress hasn't been achieved, looking at what kind of technical support or other kind of support is necessary. At the international level, we know that over in the other world of the International Labour Organization, where the world of work is discussed and normative standards are set, there were guidelines that were negotiated between employer organizations, trade unions, and governments back in 2015, before the Paris Agreement was agreed. And yet we have still conversations with environment ministries that are not making the most of that. So we've heard some of the difficulties, the challenges on, as Manuel said, forging the new industrial revolution. This is about transforming our economies and transforming our society to have greater justice, not back to the business as usual, where we have seen transitions not deliver for workers, not deliver even for those who are living in poverty, but for those who are in the workplace. We want these transitions to deliver for the dignity of work. And that dignity is reflected in having a space at the table to negotiate good agreements, not to come and have a cup of tea. We are talking about having agreements that are fulfilled. And when Alison talks about the Latrobe Valley, I know that that French energy company made an agreement with the unions. They said, we will take 5 years, we will plan this transition, and 5 months later, goodbye, I'm sorry, the jobs are done. Well, in the union movement, we talk about good faith bargaining, and that was an example where it was not. So just transition measures are very practical. It's not just a slogan. There's a whole set of discussion processes that engage people in real policies that impact skills and retraining and redeployment and engagement of investment into investing in diverse and alternative economic activities in those regions, in those local localities. But then we have people saying, well, how do we do this? Well, it's engaging with the relevant stakeholders. And that engagement has to come from, first and foremost, anticipating the change in real time and realistic timeframes. 5 years is promised and 5 months is delivered. That's very unfair. But we do need it to be fast, in fact, faster than it has been. Our experience globally is that transition processes are not being held up by workers, not being defended by workers. I see our Polish colleagues here in the room. You know, often it's the Polish coal miners who have been given the bad name, right? It's actually the companies that were not willing to engage with those workers to really plan a realistic transition away from high emissions to low emissions. And that is an all-of-economy process. So to anticipate, to engage meaningfully, to make those plans, and to enact those plans in good faith. So I would say, Dan, that why that's so important here in the COP discussions is that at a global level it's needed too. We would see that workplace, industry, national, international level, all being important. And what we're doing here these 2 weeks is trying to engage with governments to say, let's do this together, but let's have the right stakeholders in the discussions at the right time with a process that can be accountable and transparent at a global level. Otherwise, it's all behind closed doors, and we come back to actors not acting in good faith. So that transparency is important for workers to know what's going on for their lives, to be able to plan their lives, for companies to be able to make their plans, their investment plans, but their employment plans. So actually, there is great national employment planning processes going on in many countries. It's not really reflected here in the COP. That's what we want to see. Sectoral plans for particular industries and supply chains, national plans, but we know that the global economy works in a much more complex way. And we want to be able to reflect that in a meaningful way here in climate negotiations to make sure that climate policy, employment policy, good labor rights, good labor standards mean that we're investing, that money is being invested in creating good jobs, not a race to the bottom, as we have seen in the past in so many transition processes. We have a lot of distrust from members around the world in trade unions because what they've seen is promises made and not fulfilled. So we can see there's a lot of distrust in those processes, but politically, there's a lot of pushback if governments don't deliver. And we want to be ensuring that trade unions are a part of the governance processes in our own countries, but also in the multilateral systems.
Thanks so much, Alison. Really helpful contributions from all of our panelists. And obviously, every country is approaching this challenge through a different set of mechanisms and a different conversation, but there are certain core principles that we need to see applied across the board. So I wondered, I have a few questions for our panelists, but before I do that with my canned questions, does anybody in the audience have any questions, either about, and feel free to get into the nitty-gritty, feel free to throw us hardballs, what's happening in Australia right now with the Just Transition policy, or what's happening right now with the Just Transition Work Program negotiations. Welcome any questions from the audience. Holly. Yeah, maybe pass the mic around. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Holly Taylor from the Energy Efficiency Council in Australia. I'm not really going to ask questions that Dan just posed that I would ask, but my query is for everyone, in Spain, in Nigeria, in Australia. How are the coal workers in particular, but also oil and gas workers, the actual, jobs that need to be lost, how are they coping with all of this? Is there good engagement that they're going, yep, we're happy to transition, we're happy to do new things, but we want the government to help us, or are they pushing back going, nah, stuff you? What's the vibe on the ground?
I think my colleagues over here might have a useful answer to that one.
Well, no one wants to lose their job when there's no job to go to. And I would say, in terms of engagement, it really varies across the country depending on how close the cliff is. In certain regions of Australia, we have only a domestic coal industry. The coal is not of a quality for export, and there's no rail lines to export. So when that domestic power sector closes, that whole coal industry in that region will close. And so there's a sense of immediacy of, that's where really the force for a net zero authority is being felt. I guess elsewhere there's, there's other issues that potentially more immediate, such as issues with labour hire and outsourcing that are more a focus for those workers who don't see that cliff so soon. Of course, we had a big win recently on labour hire, but I won't get into that.
Anybody else want to add? Manuel?
Yeah. So at the beginning in Spain, I think, we have been fighting in the coal mining during more than 30 years. And of course, at the beginning, there were there was a big fight because, okay, if you are a mine, but your father, your grandfather, your grand-grandfather is also a miner, so sometimes it's difficult to change this mentality. And but yeah, the last 5 years with this Just Transition Institute, I think that people and local territories realize that there is no alternative, there is no other option. So, of course, I think that now they realize that yeah, they have to change, and they are asking for real alternatives with anticipate alternatives. And well, some regions now are still discontent with the process because there is no alternatives. There is a lot of, yeah, in 2 years there will be a big factory with renewable energy or whatever, but now there is no solution for workers. So yeah, now some workers are working in the, I don't know, in renaturalization of the minings. I don't know if it's okay in English.
Yeah.
To
ecosystem remediation or remediation of the mine site.
Rehabilitation of the mines to create a lake and a forest and some other activities. So yeah, I think we are getting better, but at the beginning there was like a very, very huge fight.
Yeah. I'll also add this. It's a really good question. I think that oftentimes fossil fuel workers are dragged into the climate culture war by conservative politicians as props, essentially. Look at these poor coal workers. You know, a certain Matt Canavan comes to mind. He will parade around acting like he's, you know, in solidarity with the working class. He stands with these men and women, and then what he's really doing is throwing them under the bus because he's sticking his own head in the sand and failing to prepare for the biggest structural adjustment of the 21st century. By and large, rank and file unionists are practical people, above all. And they're not interested in like ideological fire wars, you know? They're interested in like, what's my kid gonna do for a job so that they don't have to move halfway across the country and I only get to see them at Christmas, you know, in this community. And if we mount those solutions, there's nothing ideological about this. This is just getting on with it, I think, is the spirit. And so as much as the Matt Canavans of the world would like to recruit many of the oil and gas and coal workers in Australia into their, you know, fake news fest, I think as much as workers are wary of like, we have to decarbonize tomorrow and see you later, I'm sorry, that sucks as a dialogue. But likewise, the noise and the misinformation we're seeing from the conservative side is often not very resonant with fossil fuel workers because there's no plan there, and they know that. Another question here. I'll just pass mine.
Yeah, hi, thanks guys. Colin Tate is my name. I'm an employer from Australia. And perhaps unlike Nigeria or Spain, Australia has a very unique situation in that it has 3-point-something% unemployment, which means it's full employment plus some. So my question's to Alison Goodwin. I haven't heard anything around the retooling in transition, the retraining in transition, and what does that actually look like and what does that mean? Because there's 80,000 people here all talking about the necessary and urgent move from dirty energy to new energies, and those jobs are very, very different in the majority of cases. So it's fine for the employer to have to stump up and kind of make a solution here, but what is the union doing about retraining and retooling people that are going to be mid-career and out of a job?
So I think the first thing, and the feedback we get from our members is you can't put the cart before the horse. What do you actually train for if you don't have the new industry in your community? So that's the first point. It's hard to retrain for an imaginary industry that doesn't exist yet. In terms of what we push for in collective bargaining and politically, really it's about having that time frame to plan in advance so that the retraining can start before your worksite closes, and then also that you get to train or retrain on paid time, so it's not coming out of your own pocket, or it's not, you know, you're taking days off work and losing income to retrain. And I think an important thing to consider if we're looking at how to attract a workforce to the new clean energy industries is for a while it's going to coexist, and at the moment the pay and conditions in new industries are far inferior. So those employers need to perhaps get over their hostility to unions a bit and actually make those jobs attractive. So that's, I think, the main points I would make. Yeah. The union for retraining? Well, I think it's more of a collective approach across the union movement because our coverage is fairly limited to coal. So we, I guess, in this whole energy transition, we work alongside other energy unions. The ETU, for example, the Electrical Trades Union, do a lot of work on setting up retraining. I think in Queensland, I believe, they have their own registered training organisation. And so it's a collective approach across unions for retraining, yes.
Yeah, and if I can speak to that like even more specifically, there's been a really interesting approach that the Electrical Trades Union specifically, but some of our other affiliates have pursued in Australia, starting in Queensland, but I think it's starting to spread to WA a little bit. they have built these physical training centers. They have a funny, like, grandiose name, like Renewable Training Centers for Excellence or something. But what these essentially are co-run training facilities, co-run by industry and relevant unions, where they train across a raft of skills that are broadly applicable in X or Y renewable sector. And the curricula are co-developed. The actual training itself is delivered both by employer representatives and by union representatives. There are union offices on the site. And it's been a really, really successful model because what it produces is generalist workers who will be able to move across the renewable economy as it grows and shifts. What we don't want to see, but we have seen some of, is like strictly private, hyper-proprietary training modules where a company says, basically, you can come and train on our machine. There are only 2 of them in Australia, by the way, at our facility, and then you're trapped for life with us, basically. Conveniently, that tends to reduce worker bargaining power. But it also produces a really brittle transition, right? Because you've got all these extremely narrow specialists who can't move across the energy sector as it evolves. So we're really excited about that model that's being pioneered in Queensland and elsewhere, but it needs a lot more support to get to the scale that we need to see.
There's also, I guess, a potential that there would be some inequality in the transition in that, and I know this was an experience with the closure of the auto industry, there are more pathways and smoother pathways for trades qualified workers, like electricians, whereas for machinery operators, lower skilled workers, there needs to be a special effort for ways that they can be transitioned, because our experience so far is that the trades qualified workers have an easier time moving into other industries than workers who in coal power stations have incredibly specialised skills. To be a power station operator is very technical, but there is no equivalent outside of a coal power station. So for those non-trades qualified operating roles, that will be a particular challenge for retraining.
I saw a few other hands earlier. Any other questions? Yeah. Gosh. We need a runner, but I'll just be the runner. Okay, Alison Tate, thank you. Way faster than me.
Thanks, Alison. Good day, everybody. Cleanne Gabriel from KPMG Australia. Australian for only about 8 years, obviously, by my accent. I'm really interested in the skills piece in particular and retraining, and I really liked the example you gave, Ichizona, about, and it was actually a question you posed, have we done the research to really understand which particular skills are needed in this transition? So I know, of course, electricians are the example that we use across the board. I'm also from Queensland, by the way, that we use across the board. But is there a particular, some research you can point us to? Is there a publication that has already outlined the specific top 5, 7 skill sets we will need? Is there a roadmap for when we will need them and the investment needed in order to, or sort of a prioritized investment framework for rolling out those skills across, if not all of Australia, but Queensland, because I'm selfish about that?
So it's all underway. The first thing I'd point you towards is Jobs and Skills Australia recently did the Clean Energy Capacity Study. It's very extensive, looking at employment needs in clean energy industries and also looking at how we define those roles. And then in Queensland, I can't remember the exact name, but I believe they've recently released a Queensland Energy Workforce Plan. And the way it's published is almost like it's designed for school leavers even, or for people seeking training, which really itemises the kind of roles, the kind of skills that are needed for those roles and where they're applicable in the new industries. So those are the 2 that come to my mind first, but there's so much work underway since the change of government. It's a little bit of catch up. I think there's also the National Energy Workforce Survey that will get released next year. So there's lots happening.
Yeah. But I will say, so both of those documents that Alison mentioned are extremely helpful in getting a lay of the land for where are we at now and what will we need at various time increments in the future. What they don't necessarily speak to yet in a comprehensive way is what sort of investment we'll need to create the training pipelines that get all this in place. And to be honest, that's going to be a big number. Like if we're going to revitalize TAFE in Australia, if we're going to build renewable training centers for excellence, I don't know why that name makes me laugh, but in every state in Australia, and frankly every region in Australia, there's going to be a lot of federal and state level support to get that off the ground. I'm not sure we have the comprehensive roadmap for that yet, but it's something we really need to work on yesterday.
Just one question, one comment with the reskilling. I think we're always talking about reskilling like it's like focus on the on the climate change policies, and in Spain we had a study, and I think it's really important to link also the skills that we need for the fighting against climate change, but also the skills for the fight against the loss of biodiversity. So, and it is important to link both because there are a lot of reskilling programs that we have to do in both, also mitigation and adaptation to climate change, but also to fight against the loss of biodiversity.
Perfect. Do we have time for one more question, Ollie? Okay, great. One more question.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Lina from the Dutch Trade Union Youth. And my question also has to do with youth because I was wondering now all the people who are graduating high school, for example, the young workers, how are they implemented into your plans? Do you have any connections with higher educational institutions? Like how does that fit into all of this, young workers?
You guys have reached their representatives, don't you?
Well, I think that it's really important because we don't know which are going to be the future jobs. So because of climate change, but also digitalization, and in Spain, trade unions are trying to research what and fight and go against. We have like a trade union inside my union. We have like a group for young people, and we are going to universities to try to link the new jobs, the new green jobs, and the new green skills, and also trying to open the vision of the unions in Spain, because I'm worried because I used to go to universities, and even some students doesn't know what is a trade union. So that's a really big problem. So I think that all the environmental issues that we can do in a trade union is a good link to the young people, to Fridays for Future, etc. We are like doing alliance with them to try to improve this area.
So for our union, like I said, we have a very specific coverage, and so the workforce in coal power stations is typically quite old, and I mean, not old enough that it's okay to say give them early retirement. There are people who still have 10 to 20 years of their working lives. But I think in terms of young workers in coal power stations, there's really not many of them because they're good jobs and people stay for life. We have a lot of young workers in the mining industries, and we really work to engage them in our union structures. And then across more broadly, the energy unions in Australia, there's a lot of focus on engaging young workers and improving public options for training like TAFE, so that's technical and further education, where you could learn a trade rather than study at university, and making sure that young people see the pathways into blue-collar work that exist and that can be fulfilling over the coming decades?
Thank you. I just wanted to just say a very quick one. It's important that we pay attention to building partnership in terms of trying to know exactly what are the needs out there. For us, it came out clearly during our recent research. We got the different institutions involved, especially the ones responsible for training. We got them in the room, and we got some useful input from them that helps us to see clearer what the needs are, and that enriched our report, our research report. So it's important to get the relevant stakeholders talking about jobs, the new jobs being created. The different ministries also should be part of the Australia's thinking, and also get them in the room. And then finally, I think also this whole issue of just transition helps us to organize better. Now, I heard you talking about young people. Now, what is the need for me? That's what I should ask. If I want to join a union, that's the challenge you have in Nigeria. A young person will tell you, I don't have time for union. But then when he knows that the union is actually negotiating to ensure that he has a good future, because about the future of work, he has something to tie him to a union. So we are also trying to look at just transition as an instrument of organizing. We want to use it to tell the young people that we have something for you. And for the older generation who are also quitting service or quitting the workforce, we want to tell them through just transition that through social protection, we have something for you. So I think it's actually a double-edged sword that we can actually use to organize, get more people into the union, and also see how we can service the needs of our members. And finally now, the one good thing about it is that when you build strong partnership, it makes things a lot easier. We came to COP, I was hanging on that thread before, as negotiating partners with government. Now it has made the work easier for us. We can now go to government and tell them this is what we want. We can sit with them and say this is what you need to read. This is what you need to do. So this strong partnership is very important if we want to actually get more things done. Thank you.
And I would just add that it's often the unions who know the workforce intimately. So the employment impact assessments that unions have done in many countries in different contexts is really key to really good evidence base, as us policy wonks say, the evidence base of a good policy. So connecting those with evidence and numbers, but not just a number, an understanding of the quality of the jobs that are required. You can't create a systems engineer like that. So you need to have, again, a plan to anticipate what the needs are, the labour market needs, and ensure that that's relevant to a company level, a sectoral level, and a national level. Where we see that happening well, we know that there's realistic conversations about real jobs, not training for a job that may or may not exist in the future.
All right. Duly warned, we are at an hour. We maybe have time for one last quick burning question. No, we don't, in fact. I will answer your question after this panel, one-on-one, even more attention. All right, thanks, Ollie, for hosting us. Applause to Ollie, who makes all the wheels run on time in the Australian Pavilion. And thanks again to all our amazing panelists. And best of luck to all of us in getting just transition in law in the national level and here at the COP. Thanks.